God was to be their king. They weren't to have kings or presidents. They weren't to have, Congress and Senate and all that. They were simply to have God as their king, and God would speak to them through a prophet. And so God raised up various prophets who speak to the nation of Israel. Samuel was one of the big prophets that spoke to the nation of Israel. And his whole story of how he became a prophet is really interesting. Again, go back and read that. So Samuel now is God's prophet. Nation is doing well. Everything's going pretty good. But then the people of the nation look around at all their neighbors, and they say, they have kings over there. That looks really cool. It'd be cool to have a king. God, we want a king. And God tells them, no, you don't want a king. If you have a king, he's going to take your property, he's going to steal your produce, and he's also going to take your children and put them in his army to fight his wars that you may not even want to fight. You don't want a king. Yes, we want a king. God deals with them, banters back and forth a little bit, and finally they just keep begging and begging and whining and whining. God says, fine, then you can have a king. It's not going to go well for you, but you can have a king. And so we see coming on the scene, this is the top of 1 Samuel, the first king of the nation of Israel. His name is King Saul. Now, King Saul's taller than all the other people. By the way, Israelites in ancient times are only about 5'1", 5'2". They were about this tall. They were short people. They weren't tall people. And the Bible says that King Saul was handsome. He was shy, but he was handsome, and he was a head and shoulder taller than everybody else. That becomes important in our story in just a little bit. And so King Saul now becomes king, and Samuel comes to King Saul, and he says, this is how this is all going to work, okay? Because God is really the king. You're just, the vice king, vice president. You're just, you're doing God's bidding for him, but God is still king. So here's how this works. God will tell you what to do. God will tell me. God will tell me what to do. I will tell you what to do, and you just need to follow along doing what we're going to do, and God's going to be leading this whole thing. Saul's like, okay, and it goes rather well for a while. And then all of a sudden, King Saul wins some battles. Some things go really well for him. And he starts to get a big head about himself. He starts to think, wow, look what I did. And so he looks over the lands, he's looking over everything, and he's thinking, I can sort of run this. I can sort of do this. And so God tells him there's this battle you need to face, and he tells him to go out and wage war against this group of people. And he says, here's the deal. When you attack the Amalekites, that was the group that they were to wage war because they were invading and had taken some of their property. He says, you need to go attack the Amalekites and wipe them out. And so King Saul musters the army. They go up, they attack the Amalekites, but instead of wiping them out, he decides, you know what? I want to honor God because he gave us an easy victory. So I'm going to save some of the best sheep, some of the best goats. I'm going to save the king, and we're going to bring them back down to Jerusalem, and there we're going to sacrifice them to God. We're going to make God happy because we did really good work, and so we're going to take it upon our own to honor God. And he comes down and he sacrifices those, and he doesn't depose of the king. He was supposed to kill him, didn't do that. And Samuel hears about this. Samuel comes marching into the city, sort of puts his finger in King Saul's chest and says, what did you do? He says, well, I'm coming to honor God. I'm coming to worship God. I'm going to do that. He gave us an easy bit. I'm going to worship God with the spoils. And Samuel said, that is not what God told you to do. And then he said this, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as much as obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice. To heed is better than the fat of rams, for rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. Ooh. Now, he rejected him as king, but he didn't depose him. So King Saul's still on the throne. And all of a sudden, King Saul's administration begins to go south. And slowly, he starts making worse and worse decisions out of his arrogance. He starts thinking he knows how to do things. He starts not trusting in God and starts trusting more and more in his own thoughts and his own ways and his own abilities. And so over these past few chapters, Saul then, so this is about 10 to 15, 1 Samuel 10 to 15. Over these few chapters, Saul just begins to lose his mind. And I thought this just is a little personal insight here, a little commentary, if you will. When we begin to step beyond what we're called to do, when we start taking on more responsibility than God ever intended us to have, it is a recipe for disaster. And what happened to Saul is literally he began to lose his mind. He began to go mental. Because he had chosen to step out of God's will, to do things on his own, and now, instead of God holding the stress of the kingdom, now Saul was having to hold the stress of the kingdom, and he started to lose his mind. So much so they couldn't sleep, that he had troubles, and the only thing that would soothe him was music. Now this is fascinating. When Saul got deposed as king, God said, "You're done." God then went over and talked to Samuel and said, "Samuel, I need you to anoint the next king of Israel. He's already born. I need you to go find him." And so Samuel goes over and starts, praying through, where do I go? How do I go? And God leads him to this fairly productive, fairly wealthy farmer named Jesse. And he goes into Jesse's family and says, "Jesse, I've come." And they're all like, "Woo, Samuel's here." And so they're getting all the best food and whatnot because Samuel is God's prophet. Everybody in the nation knows that. And so Samuel then tells Jesse, "God has told me to come here because the next king of Israel exists within your household." Whoa! And he starts bringing all of his boys. The big strapping boys, the good-looking guys, the oldest to the youngest, and everyone comes marching in, and like, "Yeah, might be the next king, And Samuel says, "Nope, not him. Nope, not him. Nope, not him. Nope." And Jesse's like, "I'm out of boys." He's like, "You sure?" "Well, the scrawny little runt, he's out tending sheep, but he's the baby of the family. He's good for nothing. Bring him in." And David comes in. Little David. And Samuel says, "Here's the next king." Isn't that fascinating? And he anoints King David because Samuel saw God's heart in this young man. Well, one of the things, this is just fascinating. I think the Bible's so fun. Saul's losing his mind. A new king has now been anointed, so hubbub is undoubtedly going around because rumor mill even worked way back then. And so rumor mill's going around, word's getting out, "There's a new king. They anointed David over here." David had some really cool gifts, and one of his gifts was he was quite musical. He could play the harp and the lyre. He was really good at music. Well, the only thing that could soothe Saul when he was losing his mind was music, good music. Well, word had gotten out that David was also a great musician. He was a shepherd boy. So he was sort of runty and sort of rough. I would picture him growing up sort of like, you all remember the Robertsons in Duck Dynasty? That sort of be my picture of David, sort of, he's a wild man because he was out in nature, nature will take care of me. And he was sort of that kind of guy when he was younger, taking care of the sheep. But he was a great musician, and so word got out that he was a great musician. Somebody came and told Saul, "Well, there's this little kid, teenager named David. He's Jesse's son. He's one of your good landowners, pays good taxes, has big boys fighting in your army. But their little brother's a great musician." And Saul says, "Well, bring him in." And David comes into Saul, and David's music could soothe Saul. And he'd feel better, and then he'd send David away. And then he'd call David back in and feel better and send him away. And this went. He's fighting little fights over here and fighting little fights over there, and you pick enough fights, and eventually you're going to run into a big bully. Notice that? You shoot your mouth off enough, somebody's going to call you on it. And this is exactly what happened. A northern kingdom came in, the kingdom of the Philistines, and they decided, we're getting sick of this Saul. We're getting sick of what he's doing in our area. He's messing everything up. We had things sort of figured out, They wiped out the Amalekites, and, they picked on our other neighbors, and, they're just taking over. And so we're sick of it. We're going to take them on. And so the Philistines put together this huge army under their king, and they come into Israel and set up shop in order to have war. So here's what happens here. So King Saul's now going off on his own, waging all these battles, and here comes the Philistines now. They set up, the Philistines gather their forces at Sochem in Judah, that would be Israel's land. So they had invaded Israel's territory. So King Saul then hears about this. He gathers his armies, and they come up, and they camp across the valley of Elah from them, and they draw up what's called battle lines. And so here's the Philistines with their battle line, and here's the Israelites with their battle line, all on Israel territory, by the way. And there's this valley between them, and that's where the battle's going to rage. Well, as they prepare to do battle, this giant of a man named Goliath comes out in front of the Philistine army, and he shouts out a plan to resolve all of this. You send someone out here to fight me. Instead of all of our armies getting involved in this, instead of all this bloodshed and all these people dying, you find your best warrior, you send him out, he takes on me. And I tell you what, here's the deal. Whoever wins, we get to rule, and the other people get to be our slaves. Deal? That's a stupid deal. And yet, guess what Saul did? Sure! Sounds like a plan. And he agreed. Now, I know this might drive you nuts, but we're going to stop right there this morning and pick this up next week. Sorry. You read it on your own. So this is this huge battle that's mounting, and Saul agrees to these terms of this giant. And here's the funny thing. Now remember, I said Saul was a head and shoulder above everybody else. He was a tall Israelite. So if you're looking across the Israel army, Saul's head always would be taller than all the rest of the army. He's the big dude for the Israelites, and guess who's the biggest chicken in the Israelite army? Saul. Oh, I'm not going to do it. So he agrees to this fight, and then he comes back to his soldiers and says, okay, who's going to go? And they're all looking at him like, you? I'm not going. I'm the king. I'm not going. And all of a sudden, they end up in a real bad problem. Nobody's going to go. Nobody's going to go fight. So next week, we're going to come back to this, and we're going to look at the battle that raged, that happened. And then the next Sunday, we're going to talk about what happened after that battle. But this morning, I just want to focus on this coming up to this battle point. The battle lines have been drawn, the warriors have been called out, and there is a lot on the line. So let's dig into this a little bit. Let's go back and actually read a little bit of the scriptures this morning that I've already covered. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 1 through 3. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Sochem in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes-dammim between Soka and Ezekiel. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle lines to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. This was a real battle with real people that took place in history in a real location of Israel. And I don't want to over-spiritualize the story, but I just think there are so many glaring principles that we can glean from this battle as we think about the battles that we face in our lives. And the first principle that I want to teach you this morning is that the battle line has already been drawn. The battle line's already been drawn. The Bible does not speak much of what took place before the dawn of man and the creation of the world. But we do know a few things that before the age of the earth, we get a little bit of a glimpse that somewhere along the line there was a battle in heaven, and in this epic battle, God threw down Satan to the pit, and he threw out of heaven 1/3 of the angels, 1/3 of the heavenly hosts. Now, it doesn't talk a lot about that. We haven't talked a lot about that in church, but I want to read you some passages of scriptures that tell us a little bit about this battle that took place before this earth was ever here. So the first verse is Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 through 15. And I think we have it up here. How you have fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. How you were cut down to the ground. You weakened the nations. For you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the furthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. yet you shall be brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit. We get another picture from an interesting place. Ezekiel chapter 28 gives us a little picture of who Satan is. Lucifer, the devil, the evil one, however you want to label this. You were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone adored you: carnelian, chrysolite, emerald, topaz, onyx, jasper, lispis, lazuli, turquoise, and beryl. Your settings and mountings were made of gold. On the day you were created, they were prepared. You were anointed as a guardian cherub, for so I ordained you. This is the devil. This is who he was. You were on the holy mount of God. You walked among the fiery stones. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created, till wickedness was found in you. Through your widespread trade, you were filled with violence, and you sinned. So I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God, and I expelled you, guardian cherubim, from among the fiery stones. Your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you to the earth, and I made a spectacle of you before the kings. If we look over in Revelation, we find a little bit more about who Satan was, that he did not fall alone. That's where we find that God sent out 1/3 of the heavenly realm, which was a large number of the angels in heaven in Revelation 5:11. They account for the fallen angels. So we have the devil's been thrown down, the demons have been thrown out, or the angels have been thrown out. That accounts for Satan and all of his demons that are doing his bidding. And as a result, Satan has been banned from heaven. Even though he is powerful, he is a spirit being, he is well organized, he has a network of demons and powers to help him accomplish his purposes here on this earth. And those purposes, Jesus tells us what he came to do and what he's working to do. In John 10:10, Jesus says, the thief comes to steal and to kill and destroy. But I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Folks, we were born in a war zone. America's a nice place, but the Bible paints this reality for us that all of us on earth, even with its beauty and its wonders and just its spectacularness, is still nothing more than a war zone between the forces of good and evil. And here's the sad reality: we're in the middle of the battle. We're stuck in the middle of this thing. It is a force between God's angelic forces and the devil and his forces that were cast out. And the battle lines have been drawn up long ago, and every day we, like the Israel army, must come to the battle line ready and prepared to fight, because this battle rages on. Let's go on. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Again, we'll put it up here on the overhead. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week. He had a bronze helmet on his head, wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs, he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man. Have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you'll become our subjects and serve us." And then the Philistine added, "The day I defy the armies of Israel, give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing Philistine's words, Saul and all the Israelite army were dismayed and terrified. Here's the second thought I want to give you. The warriors have been called out. The warriors have been called out. King Saul had already activated his army to go and fight against the Philistines. But now as they stood on the battle line, the warriors are being called out. Not just all the army, but the warriors. Come on, send me the warriors. And I can't help but make the parallel here. The battle's raging on, and we've already seen this going on between God and the devil, but every now and then, and I think more now than then possibly, the devil calls out the warriors. Who's going to fight? Come on. Bring it on. You think you're all high and mighty because you're following God. Come on. Let's do this. Let's duke it out. And I can't help but think that our enemy picks on those who actually want to stand up for God. I don't think the devil picks on those who are like, oh, not me. I think the devil wants to pick on those who actually want to make a difference. On those who actually say, I really believe this stuff. And here we have King Saul, who had decided to run the nation on his own, trying to do what only God could do, now getting himself in trouble with a warring neighbor, and he's been called out, but he's not even willing to go into the battle. Wow. I think this is still so true of our day. We have been called out. We find ourselves in this battle that we didn't start, and a battle that we will not end, by the way, but nonetheless, the enemy is calling us out to fight. And I think this is happening right now in our land. I think it's happening in our church. I think it's happening in a lot of our lives. We're being called out. And the screws are getting put on, and the enemy's saying, yeah, do you really believe all that stuff the church teaches and you read in the Bible? Do you really believe that? Let's find out. And he's thrown us into the battle. He's testing our warrior strength. And he wants to see if we'll actually stand up in the fight. Now, there's a simple way, by the way, to avoid this whole war. Because there's a whole nation of Israel that doesn't even really know what's going on with the Philistines. We see this in this story because David's dad, Jesse, his brothers are in the army, so he has a vested interest in knowing what's going on up there. But David was out tending sheep. He calls David in and says, hey, leave the sheep to the shepherd and go see how your brothers are doing. There is a whole nation of Israel that's still going about their business. They're doing their trade. They're raising their crops. They're making their wares. They're selling their stuff. And they're totally oblivious of the war that's going on up there. And there is a way that we can just sort of end this battle if we want. And that's simply to ignore that it's even going on. Or at least pretend like it's not. To just look the other way, do our own thing, keep our heads sort of down, and just keep going about what we need to do. And here's the deal, and this is what the Philistine giant understood and knew. He knew that if he picked on this guy and killed him, the rest of the people who were oblivious to the battle would be no problem at all to defeat. If he could defeat the warrior of Israel, then there's no problem defeating everybody else because they're just going to roll over because they're already pretending like it ain't happening. And I think it's still going on today. A lot of people are lulled to sleep thinking, this is no big deal. This battle's, there's just some wacky ideas, that fanatics have. And, I'm just doing my life and doing my thing, just ignoring it. Let me tell you, when the warriors fall, you're toast. When the warriors go, you're done. And so the enemy's calling us out. And are we going to be the warrior, or are we just going to try to ignore the thing and think, it's not my problem, not my issue? Well, if you feel like you are coming under spiritual attack, I want you to take some courage and be encouraged. It means that you're being called out because you're doing something. You see, if you got your head in the sand, the devil doesn't care about you because he already knows you're done. You're wiped out. You're an easy target. Not a problem. But when you're standing up on your faith, when you're standing up for God, becoming the man that you need to be, the daughter that you should be, when you start standing up for God, guess what happens? The enemy's going to go after you. Because he knows if I can take them out, then those people are going to be easy. When the enemy looks around, I'm thinking about this as a church. When the enemy looks around and he's saying, okay, that church I'm going to attack, it's because that church is doing something, or about to, or preparing to, or getting ready to. And I don't think the enemy attacks churches that aren't doing anything. That encourages my soul when I hear the worship team saying, man, it just seems like on every front we're being attacked. On one side, it saddens my heart, and I get into that little bit of fear. But on the other side, I'm like, okay, God, what are you doing? What are you doing? Because you're up to something. You're preparing us because the enemy sees it. And the last thought I want to give you, there is a lot on the line. I already read this, but I want you to catch this little line again. Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you'll become our subjects and serve us. There is a lot riding on this battle. If Goliath wins, the Israelites become the Philistines' territory. The people become their slaves, and King Saul becomes their subject. Now, this is interesting because in that day and age, they often didn't kill a king. What they would do to a captured king, actually killing them would have been the merciful thing. But what they would oftentimes do to a king is they would humiliate them. So they would pluck out his eyes, cut off his fingers or toes so he can't run anywhere. They would cut out his tongue. They would do all sorts of horrific things to his body. And they would then create this animal-like thing that would come and be in the opposing king's throne room. And then as this king began to dismantle his kingdom, that deposed king, that defeated king, would not be able to do a thing but sit there and moan and watch his nation and his people be put to death and enslaved. That was worse than death. But that's the way they treated a defeated king, because they wanted to know that king that you lost and were rubbing it in your face. And this is what would have happened to Saul if he would lose. When we enter into spiritual battle, there is a lot on the line. I don't want to frighten you. Next week, we're going to learn how we can fight well and why we should never be afraid. How many of you are scared now? Oh. Over and over and over and over and over, the Bible tells us, do not be afraid. And here's the simple truth that I'll give you, because I don't want to leave you hanging on this till next week. Greater is He that is in you than he that is in the world. Amen? So what do we have to be afraid of? God's greater. No. Okay. Got to get back in my notes here. I'm so afraid that many, and even myself at times, sort of dismiss the seriousness of this battle. We chuck it off, or we figure it's somebody else's worry, it's somebody else's problem. It's not the real world that I live in. But the reality is we've been put on notice, and the consequences of this battle are huge. Look back at what Jesus said. The enemy desires to kill and steal and destroy. The enemy of this world wants nothing more than to kill, steal, and destroy all of God's incredible creation. He wants to ruin the earth. He wants to destroy its inhabitants, I think both now and in eternity. He seethes with hatred towards God, and any shot, any damage that he can do to God, he's going to take. And so our families, our churches, our nation, our way of life is at stake. Our very souls are at risk in this battle. And this is no laughing matter to just chuck off. There's a lot riding on the line of this. And if we don't stand up and fight, who will? Who will? I'm so excited about next week's sermon. This is just a precursor to that. Really hope you'll come back, or I hope you'll tune back in online as we get into a little further into this mini-series. My goal this morning is simply to present to you that this is reality. This is a battle that's really going on. And I don't want us, and I don't think that we can afford to pretend that this battle doesn't exist and just go on with life as usual. If we simply put our heads in the sand and pretend this battle's not taking place, then we've already lost, and the battle's over. And so I want to give a rally call this morning. Rise up. Let's rise up. Rise up, O men of God. There's one more little scripture that I want to read. Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Verse 20, early in the morning, David left the flock with the shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle position, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up the lines, facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of the supplies, ran to the battle lines, and greeted his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from the lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. When the Israelites saw this man, they all ran from him in great fear. Now, can you picture this? We're back into football season. Anybody watch the Browns last week? It was actually a good game. Disappointing, but a good game. But picture this. You ever see, movies or clips where you have the football team or basketball team, they're in the locker room and they're chanting, oh, 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 and we're number one, and you're getting all riled up and they're getting all stoked about the game that's going to take place. And this is what's happening. These two armies have gathered forces, and every morning it's like going into the locker room and they're chanting, oh, we're going to win, we're number one, we're going to fight, and they're doing this big thing, and then they all come marching down to the battle line, sort of marching onto the football field. And so here comes Israel, all stoked. They are pumped. And they get down to the battle lines. They're ready to go. And then all of a sudden, here comes the Philistines chanting too, So it's like Kansas City coming onto the football field, and they're coming on and they're calling out their numbers and whatnot. It wasn't fair that we had to play them in Kansas City. I think we could have won if they'd just shut up the crowd, but whatever. So they're coming on the football field, and they're all sitting there, staring, looking at each other. This game's going to be epic. And then all of a sudden, this huge linebacker that can actually run, because linebackers usually can't run, comes walking out and says, we're going to beat your heinies. And all I was going to say Browns, but the Israelites, they're like, okay. And then they start backing away. Except for one scrawny little running back. He was fast, little booger, but he was tiny. This little snotty boy named David. And he sees that big old huge linebacker that can run. Like, well, what are you so afraid of? We can whip his hiney any day. Yet all of his team's going that way. The battle lines have been drawn, and we have to choose sides. Even if you like Jesus and you like God, doesn't mean that you're willing or you're ready to fight for God. So it leaves us with a huge haunting question. When the battle comes upon you, are you going to fight, or are you just going to cower in fear like all the Israelites? Are you going to go home with your tail between your legs and hope that the battle will just go away? I don't want this to happen. I wish that would be true, but it usually doesn't work that way. Or are you going to respond as the spiritual battles wage like David and simply look up? And by the way, he took heat. We're going to see this. He got his brothers mad at him. Who are you? You're going to be like little scrawny David and say, did you hear his lip? How dare he? Which side are you going to go on? And I really hope next week we can come back, and as you come back, we can zero in on the one who was unlikely to win this story, who becomes a national hero. And we're going to look at how this little scrawny David, I'm going to ruin the story, he wins, okay? Sorry, now you might not have to come back, but we're going to look at how did he win? How did this little guy, who should not have won this battle, beat this monster of a man? And I think as we look at this, we're going to see some tools that we can put in our tool bag and some understanding that we can have. Because this is a battle that whether you like it or not, we're all in. And in the last couple of weeks, it seems like the battle's been getting worse with all the stuff happening in our lives. And I want to leave you this morning asking you, are you going to stand up and fight? And I want to encourage you that if you choose to stand up and fight, here's the great news, you're going to win. You're going to win. The only way you lose is to not fight. But the way to win is to actually stand up. And if you stand up and say, I'm going to wage into this, the Bible tells us over and over and over and over again, those who stand with God will never be ashamed, will never be defeated, will never fail to have a victory. Stand with God. We're going to sing a final song. I threw this on the worship team, so my bad if it doesn't come off good. But if you've been around the church, you might remember an old song that we used to sing around the church, Rise Up, O Men of God. How many of you remember that song? Rise Up, O Men of God. The worship team was so excited about this, they made Michelle turn on the pipe organ, because we're going to make this old school this morning. I'm going to invite you to stand up. We're going to sing this. We're going to sing it over the next couple weeks as sort of our rally cry. We're going to sing it in a couple different ways. We added more than more verses than we had up here, so we're going to be following the overhead up here. But let's sing this out this morning as our battle cry. Rise up, O men of God. And they told me I have to sing with them. Back to the words that we had in the paper because that got all messed up. Okay, so I'm going to call these out. Rise up, O men of God, have done with lesser things. Give heart and soul and mind and strength to serve the King of Kings. We'll just do three. Just three verses. As the weeks go on, dear Heavenly Father, I pray that you will send us out of here as victors. Even though the battle may be raging this week in our lives, even though things may not work the way we want them, and we just may be feeling frustrated and our faith shaken, we choose to dig in our heels. We choose to stand solidly upon your promises, and we're going to stand up, and we're going to be your warriors in this battle. And so I pray you'll begin to bring us little victories as well as big victories and reveal to us what you're doing in this grand battle that we are in. So send us out, God. Go with us this week as we go as victors already in this war. Amen. Thanks for coming this morning and worshiping with us. You're dismissed. Don't forget to drop off your survey or prayer requests in the barrel at the back.